Thank you everyone for joining today. My name is Nathan Puccini. I am one of the marketing managers here at Data Science Dojo. And today I have Bill Franks with me. And Bill is he's the director of the Center for Statistics and Analytical Research at Kennesaw State. He is also the chief analytics officer for the International Institute for Analytics. And he's also the author of his book, which I'm just not finding the title of real quick, but we'll post the link to the book as well as Frank's website as well, so you can get to know him a little better. We have Bill talking about winning the room, creating and delivering an effective data-driven presentation. So Bill, why don't you go ahead and get started for us?
All right.
And I'll interrupt you whenever we have some time for questions.
All right. Yeah, well, thanks for the intro and welcome everybody. I'm going to walk you through, as you can see here, my newest book, Winning the Room. And if you were on a few minutes ago, we were just kind of chatting about the genesis of the book. And it's based on my opportunity over the years to go around and meet with tons of large companies and have to present to them. And so the whole focus of this book, as we get into it, is in three basic sections. There's planning. You got to plan, lay out, figure out what you're going to present. We'll talk through that. There's developing in terms of actually creating your presentation, and then there is delivering. So I'm going to take us through a little bit in each. The book is organized in a series of very short tips, 119 to be exact. We're obviously not going to be covering 119 tips today. So what you'll notice is the tip numbers are going to be in order from lowest to highest, but they're not going to be sequential. So I've picked out a handful from each section that I thought might be most relevant for those of you here. One disclaimer before I get into it: this book and the presentation I'm giving today, it's about a live presentation to a live audience that is typically non-technical. So this is very common. Those of us in the data science analytics arena, we might build some type of model, some type of complicated process, but we have to go explain that then to whoever sponsored that effort, who often might be someone from marketing, someone from operations who's not very technical. So it's really important to understand that context. Secondarily, I've kept all the visuals very simple, and there's two reasons. The first is I'm trying to illustrate very key points and very specific points, so I make it easy to do. So I'm not proposing that the specific visuals I'm showing are the ultimate way to do it. I've actually kept them to be very basic PowerPoint, and that's also, I think, a nod to the reality that today still 95% of presentations are done with basic Excel and PowerPoint charts and graphs and slides, right, wrong, or indifferent. So I wanted to put things in the familiar format. So the key about the whole book is you've got to win over a room if they're going to take action, which is the ultimate thing here. You have to go into a room with a presentation. And it's not just about talking about facts. It's not just about presenting results. You have to get that audience, who's often far less technical and knowledgeable than you on the subject matter. You have to get them to understand what it is that you found. You have to get them to understand and see the implications of that. And then most important, they have to take action. Everything's a waste if they don't take the action. That's the real key. So I'm going to start with a couple of points around just some fundamental strategic things that you need to keep in mind that underpin any presentation you're going to do. And the first one's a little bit controversial, and it took me a number of years to come to grips with this myself, but results are not the biggest factor in the success of your presentation. As a technical person, that's horrifying. Whether you're a data scientist, if you're an engineer or an accountant, to us, it's all about, I've got the facts, I've got the figures, I've got the numbers, that's all that should matter. Unfortunately, it's not. And I like to say that at most 50% of your success is having all those results, and at least 50% is how you package, present, and sell those results to the sponsors so that they'll take action. Now, in an ideal world, it would be all about the numbers. And I'm not saying the numbers aren't important. You have to have proper numbers. I'm just saying that when you get to the point that you have accurate, compelling results, you're barely halfway there. You've got to figure out how to package and present that if you're going to succeed. So you have to think about your results as necessary, but not sufficient, to go back to a math proofs 101 phrase. Now, another thing that technical people, especially, I know a lot of data scientists make this mistake, and I will admit I was guilty of it early in my career as well, even though we didn't call ourselves data scientists at that point in time. And that's to say data literacy is a two-way street. A lot of us will make the mistake of saying, oh, I went to that meeting and, the marketing team, they just didn't understand what I'm talking about. They really need to learn more about this, how AI works and how it can apply to their business. And I wish they knew more things. And that all can be true. There could be an element of that for sure. But if you look up the definition of literacy in the dictionary, it's reading and writing, it's sending and receiving information. And so it is as much a responsibility of you to prepare your information at a level your audience can understand as it is for your audience to be prepared to a reasonable level to receive that information. And that can get lost. If you're continuously leaving rooms being frustrated that the audience didn't understand you, I can almost guarantee you the problem is you at that point, not your audience. And so what this means is, think of it this way. I could go give a talk like I'm giving you right now. Let's say I went to an elementary school, a high school, and a college today. I could talk about these same themes, but I'd have to be very different in how I address them based on those three audiences that are very different levels of knowledge and experience with which to absorb it. It's on me to adjust to the elementary school audience and to ramp it up then for the graduate school audience. Similarly, you have to always ask yourself, how far can I take this non-technical audience and how much do I need to change what I'll say to meet what I can reasonably expect them to do? And most important in any presentation, the whole point of a live presentation is to tell a story, to have something to say, to have a narrative, to try and get people to understand it. The worst thing you can do is come in with a whole bunch of text, particularly small text, and start reading, or worse yet, just overwhelm people. So I'm about to show you an absolutely horrific slide that I wish doesn't look like hundreds of slides I've seen over the years. People will tend to pack on basically what should be a Word document into a slide. And there are so many problems with this. Other than that, it looks horrible. It has way too much information. Even those of you now who are reading and realizing that most of what I've written here is all just throwaway to fill the slide, you can't help but read it. And guess what? Every second you're reading what's on my slide is another second you're not listening to what I have to say, to what findings I found, and to what you might be able to do about it. So you do not want your audience reading. They're there to listen to you. So how do you solve this problem? In this scenario, for example, if you notice, there's 4 actions. I would just reduce it down to those 4 actions. In fact, I would use animation to have them come up one at a time as I'm ready to talk to them. The point is, what's on the slide should be a small visual aid to help keep the audience on track with what you're talking about. But it's your narrative and it's you presenting is where they should get their information in live presentation, not from your slide. In this case, I put this whole slide up. Anyone will be through it in a matter of seconds and the attention is back on me. So there's appropriate places to put the detail. It's not in your live presentation. It's in a leave behind document, or it's in an appendix or somewhere else. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So before I go to the next section, I'll just check, Nathan, were there any, did anybody have any questions during that first section?
I'm not seeing any questions at this point, so why don't you continue?
Okay. So let's assume you've kind of got your foundation laid and you know what you need to do. Now you have to spend time designing the presentation. And this is super important because you've got to think through what are the facts you're going to communicate, in what order, in how much detail, what's the takeaway that you want to give. And the analogy I like to use here is making a movie. No one goes to make a movie and just starts shooting scenes at random and figures at the end they'll patch it together into a hit film. What they have is not only a detailed script with all the words that everyone's going to say, but they've got the entire scene mapped out. When is that car going to come through? How fast is it going to come through? I mean, everything is mapped out in excruciating detail before they start filming. It's very similar here. People too often just say, oh, I'm going to go start building slides because I have a presentation. You shouldn't start building a slide till you have your entire thing laid out. Now, as you develop it, one mistake, again, that technical people make all the time, and this is particularly true of data scientists, and I say that as someone who comes from this background. I know I'm guilty of it myself. We love to give technical details. Ironically, with a non-technical audience, not only do the technical details not help, they can undercut your impact and actually lose credibility because you're going to come across as someone too technical to help them. And that's the stereotype they're concerned about when you start. You don't want to reinforce that. So let me give you an example. Your car's broken down and you go into shop number one. Shop number one, you're all going to agree the mechanic is far more transparent and detailed with it. So what I hear is, well, Bill, it's not really sure what it is yet. We're going to have to go in and do some tests. We're going to do a pressure test, which involves hooking up this piece of equipment and that piece of equipment and looking at all of these various readings and then determining if the pressure's okay. Then we're going to do a temperature test. And here's what that looks like. And after 10 minutes, they're through taking you through these details of these tests that you've never heard of and don't understand. Then, because they want to be thoroughly transparent, they say, well, this could be anywhere from $800 to $5,000. We just won't know until we get in there. In full disclosure, we've got a supply chain issue right now with one of our suppliers. It seems to be a transmission problem. They don't typically supply those parts, but just in case they do, that could delay it. And also my mechanic's not feeling that well today. And if they're out sick tomorrow, well, we might be delayed in getting you a quote, but I'd love for you to leave your car. Here's the thing. That person was incredibly detailed, incredibly honest, and incredibly transparent about the challenges. And you probably don't want to leave your car. Mechanic number two, you walk in. You know what, Bill? I'm going to have to look under the hood a little bit to figure out what this is. In my experience, it's typically about $800. Obviously, it can vary. If you leave the car with me, I can get you back an answer as to exactly what it'll cost and exactly when you can have the car back within 24 to 48 hours. You'll probably leave your car with that second person because they told you the most relevant and critical information, which was, I can get you a price. It averages around this, though it can vary, and I'll tell you when I get it. All the rest of the stuff, you wouldn't go to the mechanic if you knew how to do those things. You would do it yourself. And similarly, you want to focus on telling your audience how they can make use of their on their job of your results. And when they ask questions, you have to remember that their semantics in terms of what they ask may not mean that they want to know what you would mean if you asked it. So let's take an example. I'm at a car dealership, now that I'm on the car theme, and I asked the car salesperson, who's very much into cars by definition of their job, how does this backup camera work? Because I haven't seen one before. They start talking about, oh my gosh, it's great. It's a 1080p high def LCD screen connected with an HDMI cable to an onboard computer with this chipset and this much RAM, and it's going to compute some vectors that it's going to map onto the screen that'll show you where you're going, and goes on and on. In the world, because while you said, how does this work? And for a true technical person, they might want to know literally how it works. What you really mean is, how do I use it? What you probably wanted that person to say is, oh, well, hey, Bill, this is great. You're going to see what's behind you from the camera, and it's actually going to put some lines to show you where you're going. If it beeps at you, you probably want to stop. Like, okay, great. So a tangible example in the world of analytics here. Take a classic propensity model. If the marketing person says, so Bill, can you tell me again how these response models work? They do not want me to go into a discussion about logistic regression or decision trees and error margins, et cetera, et cetera. What they want to know is something like, oh, well, remember, what will happen at the end of this is we're going to have all of your customers ranked from highest to lowest probability. You tell us how many you want to contact, we'll give you a list. Now they say, great, I'm ready to go. So focus on this. When someone asks a question, what do they probably really mean in practice? Not what would you have meant if you asked. So back to these details. How do you give the details then? You might be saying, well, Bill, but there's so many details someone needs to know. You got to create a distinct leave behind document. There's numbers of ways you can do this. For a super important project, say a 6 or 12 month massive project, you might literally write a written paper, almost like back in your college days, of all the results. You can use appendices a lot. My favorite is to have a hybrid. Use the notes sections, for example, within PowerPoint, where you can add a bunch of additional details. If you put it at a reasonable size font as well, you can see I can fit a decent amount of information and still have it print on one page. This was actually a screenshot of a single page. Maybe I let it wrap to 2 pages, but it'll still make me keep it relatively short as opposed to a huge 600-page paper. But there's other advantages to this. While I'm talking to this chart, the audience will get the chart because I'm giving them all the context. When they look at it later, they may or may not remember those details. So when you print out the notes pages, they'll have all the detail right below the chart explaining that context. Equally important, when I'm getting ready to go into my presentation, I can look at the notes view and I can review the key points I wanted to make on each chart and the key context points that I have to cover myself. And for those of you who don't know, this is super easy to do. When you print, you can print a notes page in PowerPoint. It defaults to slides, but this would print out, and there's even a master under the same menu as Slide Master that you can format and configure. So it's a really handy tool. And one last tip out of this section is you absolutely want to show the fewest numbers necessary to prove your point at any time. Here's a very basic table. 5 products, 4 quarters, some totals. I'm up to 30 numbers. If you notice the headline, organic honey grew by over 50% this year. Well, you could find that on this chart by looking around, but it's kind of hard to find that and actually see it. Worse yet, I might have people who care more about regular honey, or who care more about flavored honey, or who care more about Q4. And now they're going to get lost looking at the other numbers in the graph that have nothing to do with the point I'm trying to make and miss everything that I say. So this is an example where highlight exactly the numbers that you need to see, put a very basic chart so they cannot miss your point. Then move on to your next point. Over a series of charts, I might cover every single number on that last table. And that's okay, but I'm doing them one at a time in context. And then at the end, I might be able to say, oh, by the way, here's all the numbers in a table for you. Or there's a table in an appendix that has all the numbers. But while I'm presenting live, I'm able to keep them focused. And then always be sure to distinguish technical significance from business significance. Right? If you're an architect, you can have a beautiful building design, but if it doesn't fit in the plot of land that you've got, it's useless. Similarly, I can come back to a sponsor and tell them it's amazing. We're going to get a 10% lift in sales if, based on this test. That's great statistically, but what about the costs? What about any resource constraints to execute? What about any risk or legal factors, regulatory factors, et cetera? You've always got to put pragmatic and business significance on an equal footing with the technical significance, because one without the other is absolutely useless. So you always want to be thinking ahead and saying, okay, great, statistically or analytically, this looks like a good move. Let's make sure it's not against any policies. Let's make sure that if it requires some kind of work, if you're a retailer, some kind of resetting of store shelving space, make sure that you have the ability to get those resources allocated, or you're going to have a big failure. So before I move on to the next, Nathan, I'll just check in with you, see if there's any questions coming.
I am still not seeing any questions, so I just want to remind people, if you have questions, go ahead and throw those in the Q&A tab to help us keep everything organized. Even if you're on one of our live streams, go ahead and ask your question in the chat, and we will pull that into Zoom for you. So, but right now, Bill, no questions so far, so go ahead, keep going.
All right, I'll keep it rolling. So let's talk through your wording and your text. These are obviously critical things. You want to keep your text to a minimum, as we're going to talk about, but to the extent you put text, you want to make sure that it's on target. So first point, you want to minimize the number of words on your slides every single time. And there are some strategies to help you do this. For example, what I'll typically do when I first create a slide or I have a point, I will literally just free form whatever my thought process is about what I want to say. I'm not worried about it reading well. I'm just worried about what's the point that I want to make. And I'm making sure I have my, kind of my flow going. Then I'll go back into another pass and attempt to shorten it even further. And then finally, by the end, I'll get it down to its essence, right? And in this case, just ship promotional funds from product A to product B. That's all that needs to be in writing. And the key here is that in writing, that very last point here looks about right, and it reads okay in your head. If I literally just got to a slide and said, so I want you to shift promotional funds from product A to product B, and that's all I say, that sounds a little short. So the point is to your narrative. I might say something much more like the first line. I might have a few sentences of additional context as I deliver it, but you want to get your text down to a very small number of words that get to the point, and then you can talk to it. Similarly, always use simple terms and definitions. This is something that data scientists make a huge mistake. So in my capstone, master's capstone class, this happens all the time. We run some response models to predict loan defaults or predict response, and they'll inevitably come, because the statistical packages will output this, with their accuracy, their sensitivity, their specificity. Here's the point. Those are technically accurate terms. Nobody without a statistical or analytical background is going to know what those terms mean. So you're going to have to explain them. But I'll go even further. I've been doing this for years. I have trouble remembering which sensitivity is and which specificity is because I don't use them every day and they sound similar to me. So what I always say is put it in plain English. A true positive rate, a true negative rate. People understand that. When I see a student put this up and I say, explain to me, what are those, right? They'll inevitably, as part of their definition, talk about a true positive rate or a percent correctly classified or some variation thereon. And then my point to them is, so here's the point. You put a term that the audience won't understand. Now, verbally, you explain it. And at the moment, they kind of think they get it. But later, when they get your handout, they're not going to remember what sensitivity and specificity are anyway. Go straight to the plain English. It's going to make it much easier on your audience. It's going to make you feel like you're getting your point across, and they'll feel like you're actually understandable, which is important. And in a live presentation, if it can't be read, don't display it. And this sounds obvious, but I'll show you an example. A lot of times people will have, a quote with a footnote of who the expert was. They'll have additional reading links. They'll have the image source credits. This all might be appropriate for a leave behind. And this might be an example where I have my PowerPoint I'm going to present, and I have a leave behind where I would leave this detail. But for the presentation itself, get rid of all that other stuff. Have the quote, have the images. When it's live, no one's going to be able to absorb or read that other stuff anyway. They'll have it in the handout. So you really want to look for opportunities to cut as much out of your slide as possible while you're speaking. Back to it, because I can't say it enough. You want the audience focused on you while you're talking, not your slides. Another rookie mistake, use appropriate spacing. If you open up a PowerPoint and just fire up the base templates, they tend to put things really, really close together like this. First of all, I would never put up 5 points typically like this at a time, because again, you want to take the people through it one at a time. But when it's this tight, it's just very hard to see. If all I do is add a little space, it makes it much easier to read the final product or even the leave behind. So my little rule of thumb is whatever size my font is, and typically my fonts are going to be at least 20, maybe 24 or 28 point, I will put 1/2 to 2/3 of my font size as an additional spacing between points. I find that works pretty well. You want to go a little beyond single spacing. So anyway, this is another one. Very simple, but I can't tell you how many times I see people come in with all this compressed text. And one of the biggest killers of credibility are typos, whether it's on a resume or in a presentation. Never ever trust spell check and grammar check in Microsoft Office or Google Documents. They're wrong a lot. I write a blog every month. It's anywhere from 600 to 1,000 words. I will typically overwrite that at least 1 to 2 times per blog. A book like this that I wrote, I probably overrode spelling and grammar checker tons of times. Even worse, though, are charts and images. You go into PowerPoint or Excel and a lot of other charting packages, they will not spell or grammar check text that is within a chart object. What this means is whatever you type is going to come right through, and you can find tons of typos in this. Very embarrassing. When you have charts, you've got to look word for word. I suggest you look word for word at everything on anything that you're presenting, but particularly within those charts and graphs. So that, Nathan, I'll take a pause here for you. See if there's anything that's come up.
Perfect. We do have some questions. So let me just. Okay, so I'm going to read, and I think this may have been more relevant to the previous section, but Javier sent it in as I had told you to move on. So I'm going to read Javier's. It's a little bit longer, so you may want to pull up the Q&A just so you have it in front of you. But the problem Javier is having in some presentations is that he wanted to go to the facts the way you are telling, or you were telling us to, just present the facts. And then some of the attendees wanted the technical details as well. And then when he would explain the technical details, these people would complain that it was too confusing and that he needed to make the presentation in a more executive way. So how would you deal with this type of a situation?
This is a really tough one and a very common one. So if I'm reading this right, what he said, some of the attendees wanted to go into technical details, but then somebody else gets upset. So here's the thing. This gets back to, this is about presenting to a largely non-technical audience. Of course, if you're presenting data scientists to data scientists, you can go in more technical detail, but you still have to be aware, for example, if I'm giving you a presentation on my NLP analysis and you don't know much about NLP, it doesn't matter how technical you are and how good at data science you are. I still have to be at a proper level. In a mixed audience like this, what I always say is, this is where you want to have your appendix and your backup ready to go. What you can say is, hey, look, I've got tons of technical details behind the scenes. For example, here's an appendix I've got that has, the details on the parameter estimates. But for the purpose of today, I want to get through some of the main points, and we can dive into that later. And what you can do then is you can let them know that you do have the details, that you're purposely holding them back for now, and that you'll be happy to jump into them later. The executive or the senior people in the room are almost always going to want you to go that way. So if you're going to make someone upset, make the technical person who thinks you're supposedly hiding something upset, because you can always prove to them later that you did not, versus the executive, if they feel like you went over their head and it was too confusing, they're not going to give you another shot.
Awesome, thanks. And then David and Anita, also great questions, but we will get to those at the end. So Bill, back to you.
All right. So numbers and labels, pretty self-explanatory. You obviously need to use a lot of numbers by definition if it's a data-driven presentation. So how do you do that properly? There's a couple of little things I'll point to. Only use the precision required to make your point. Again, this is something I think gets by us technical folks love to be precise, but even more so, a lot of packages, whether it's Python, R, SAS, will default to giving you a whole lot of decimal places. So if you look here, yummy flavor outsold yucky flavor 5-1. And I have $509 million down to the penny. Well, there's a couple things with this. Kind of hard to read all those digits. And I've got percentages out to the 1,000. I don't think we really have confidence you can have a $509 million accurate down to the penny to begin with, but it really is distracting from the point, right? Why do we need to show all that? I would suggest you abbreviate down 509 million versus 101, 83 to 17%. It's very easy to see the 5-1 because that's what matters. Now, if someone goes, well, exactly how much was in the 509? To the last question, you go, look, I've got the exact numbers. We can go through those later, but I wanted you to see the pattern here. So you don't want to, being over precise, again, it can be off-putting and make it seem more intimidating than it need be. You also have to match your precision level that you show to the accuracy level that you claim. If you cut and paste stuff out of a package like, say, Python that gave you 4 decimal points and you say our predicted response rate is 10.2453%, people might assume that you're committing to 1/10,000% accuracy, which is clearly ridiculous. Just because the numbers get spit out of an analytical package, you have to think through what's the appropriate level to show it. So oftentimes you're probably just confident around, hey, it's 10%, give or take. I also am a huge fan of not necessarily talking in confidence intervals in a statistical way of it's 10 plus or minus 0.2%, et cetera. I like to do just a range. Hey, we're pretty sure it's somewhere between 9.8 and 10.6. What this does, it reinforces that it's not exact and that there is a range, but at least it quantifies the range. But just even how you present those numbers will both A, show the level of confidence you have properly, but also B, make people feel comfortable. Also, always format numbers. This is rookie mistake. A lot of analytical packages, they'll just spit out numbers. They don't necessarily format them by default. So you'll see a chart like this. Very hard to read because A, I have a lot of digits, and B, there's no commas. So think how much easier this is on your brain. But let's combine the last 2 points. Even better, just show the main point, right? My endorsement took sales from 56 to $659 million, right? So if anybody wants my endorsement afterward, we'll work out a contract. Another thing, we have to translate real data that's often textual for predictive models into numbers. So classic example, we have our predicted and actual. 0 and 1. We're all used to thinking of 1 is typically a success, or 1 typically means, a person responded, et cetera. And we kind of know what this means because we look at it all the time. A non-technical audience might not. And worse yet, it's not 100% clear. So what does 0 and 1 mean? Well, you could go a little bit better and add a little legend at the bottom. Helpful, but again, even if you've translated a lot of your fields that were categorical into numerical buckets or bins or some other transformation for your model like this, when you show it back, just call it what it is, response and non-response. Your non-technical audience couldn't care less what was 0 and what was 1. It just doesn't matter to them. They just want to know what was a response, what was a non-response. And then be careful to focus on the outcome of interest. And what do I mean by that? Outcome of interest means there's certain ways that everyone looks at things within a business environment. And it's often very obvious. So for example, here I say patients are 10% more likely to survive if they avoid infection. And that doesn't sound all that impressive. It's only a 10% relative increase, but doesn't it sound weird to your ears? 10% more likely to survive if they avoid an infection. That's not normally how we talk about things. What we normally talk about is they're 240% more likely to die if they get an infection. So mathematically, you have two equivalent statements, but the metric of interest is the chance of death from an infection, much more likely than decreased chance of death from not getting an infection. And this is one of these cases where semantics by industry and even by company can be a little bit different. You want to make sure you match to what people expect to see, because I can come in and deliver this mathematically accurate finding here, and everyone will be probably totally confused and not understand it, as opposed to I put this up, everyone's going to get it. And last, always make sure that you have consistent and clear scaling. So this is one of my favorite examples. We got two products, no scale, easy to assume that they're the same. Well, let's add scale. And as it ends up, they're an order of a million different. Leaving a scale off is a very bad mistake. In fact, you can find even major news organizations today, they'll put up a graph on a TV show and they'll forget to put on a scale. And if you go into a PowerPoint or Excel, it will fill your graph space regardless of how big it is. So if I have a difference of 0.001 or 1 or 1 million, and I had 2 points, it's always going to make the graph look pretty much the same. So you can make something that's a trivial difference look super important by playing around with your scales. And I wish it wasn't done as much as it is, but it is. Often accidentally, sometimes not. So Nathan, I'll pause here.
Perfect. And so this is another question from Javier. So what if the audience is from different countries with different number formatting? Should we hope that the people are used to knowing or are used to the differences, or should we note that at the beginning which number formatting will be used? Is there any rule about this?
That's a really good one. So obviously you're probably going to have to pick one. What you could do there's really two different scenarios. One is you're pretty sure everybody's going to know the difference, but you've chosen to use one or the other. You could just say up front, hey, I know, our primary audience, most of our audience here is in India or is in Europe or is in the US. So I'm going to use this format or the other format. If you actually think there's people who won't be familiar with the different format, you could just do a translation. Hey, when we write a percent in this country, we put a comma, it's 5,2%. In this country, we know you do 5.2%. So just keep in mind that when you see a 5,2, it's a 5.2. Now, how do you decide which to use? Who's the biggest decision maker in that room? Whoever the people you most need to influence are, whatever they're going to get the best, err on making them happy and err on making the other people less happy. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if 9 out of 10 people loved you if the one person that didn't is the person that matters. And it doesn't matter if 9 out of 10 people thought your presentation, they didn't like you, didn't match their format, if the person who's making the decision loved it and decides to move forward. So just always kind of look at and if everyone's equal, if it's a conference, let's say I'm presenting at a conference where everyone's a pretty much equal audience member, you might ask, are most people coming from the US? Are they coming from Europe? Are they coming from Asia? And then you could purposely map to the majority there if everybody has an equal. So last then is, so you've got your text, you have numbers you got to show, there's charts, there's images, there's layouts. How are you gonna make this flow well? So one thing is I'm a fan of using a mix of layouts just for the sake of adding some variety. Let's say you have an analysis and you have let's say a common thing. We're going to look at the demographic profile of the buyers of our product as one example. You might have 5, 6, 7 demographic factors to go through, all of which you could loosely do something like this. right? The thing is, if you see slide after slide with exactly this format, people start to get bored. So you can do little things to mix it up. Have some with the graph on the left and the comments on the right, have some with the comments on the left and the graph on the right. You might have some on the top and the bottom. I also sometimes mix it up. Maybe I throw in a pie version. Again, this is just illustrative, but the point is when you look at this, I'm presenting the same type of data, but I'm kind of randomly, I'm not going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 in a totally repetitive pattern. I'm kind of randomly mixing up what the format of the slide is, just so the audience doesn't get so bored of seeing visually the exact same thing. This sounds like a trivial thing to do, but it's very, if you think in your own experience, when you see the same thing again and again, your mind starts to kind of get dull. Whereas at least if you've mixed it up a little bit, it adds a little variety and it makes it look like in this overhead shot, for example, it looks like I have a whole bunch of interesting stuff. If you saw 12 of the exact same layout, you'd be like, oh gosh, this is boring. Another very common data scientist mistake, showing raw output or cutting and pasting raw output and just putting it in an image into a PowerPoint. Never ever show it. Here's one piece of output. This happens to be from SAS. I could have brought up R. I could have brought up Python. I could have brought up about anything else. And by default, they're going to put out stuff that's very useful for us technical folks, but isn't formatted very nice, right? This has no commas in the numbers. It's got scientific notation, a whole lot of things. If there's important, and a lot of numbers in one place. If there's some important things to talk about from this could be in an appendix. I would actually say you want to format this more nicely in an appendix, and then you can go through the critical pieces one at a time. It is possible within SAS and any other package as well to format things much more nicely. But that takes a lot of time and effort. You already have templates for nice formatting set up. You're welcome to use those. The point is you don't want to use the default raw output. You really got to pretty things up. When you put output that looks like this in front of a non-technical audience, their head spins and it just screams, I'm too technical to help your business problem. And similarly, just keep it really, really, really simple. Like I said, I'm doing purposely here, simple PowerPoint graphs, or even if you're going to use a tool like a Tableau or a Spotfire for visualization, right? Keep them relatively simple. Why would you show a graph like this? I see people do this sometimes. Oh, cool. I can do not only triangles, but 3D pyramids, and then I can add patterns. This doesn't, and then there's this crazy font. The bottom line is just putting a really basic bar chart here is so much easier to both read and to see the key message I want to get across. Remember, in most data-driven presentations, your goal is to impart important information and get an action. It's not to win design awards. I always say a beautiful presentation that would literally win awards from a design company for its design, if it's not actually communicating the data well, and if you go up and deliver it really poorly, you're going to lose. You can have a very unappealing visually or very rudimentary presentation, but if it has the right information and you deliver it well, you're going to have a winner. In an ideal world, you'll have both. But my point is better to have it basic and meaningful than to do something fancy and derail yourself. You also need to think about colorization. This is super simple. Here's an example where, for whatever reason, I put the negative numbers in green and the positive number in red. That just looks wrong. We're used to seeing positive in green, negative in red. I see people a lot of times, here in town in Atlanta, Coca-Cola's headquarters. Coke, famously red. Their main rival, Pepsi, famously blue. If you go in to present at Coke here in Atlanta, and you're not going to use a Coke template, you sure as heck better have a largely red theme, and you better for sure not have a largely blue theme, or you're going to go down, in flames. Similarly, for whatever reason, baby boys, blue is the color that's used, and baby girls, pink is the color that's used. Whether you like blue or like pink is really irrelevant. If you start putting green for boys and brown for girls, no one's going to know what you're talking about, and it's going to cause them to be confused in their brain. So you just need to stick with whatever color conventions are there. Similarly with a sports team, use the sports team's color themes and do not use their rival. Sounds simple. I have seen all of those things done. And then back to the audience. Do not show technical and architectural diagrams. I think we had that one question earlier about what about people who are questioning whether I have all the detail. You might toss up an architectural diagram or something technical and say, hey, by the way, here's the architectural diagram that I've laid out today. I'm not going to spend time because I want to focus on some other things, but it's in here for you later. And if people really want to drive you back to it, they can. But here's the problem with these. if you're not technical and you really care about the results, no one really cares about how your data came from a source system and then flowed into this repository where it was then sent through this pipeline, where it was then landed into this lake, where it was then utilized by this analytical package to then go to this reporting tool. They don't really care. They care about what you found. And the thing is, you can go through a lot of explanation for what all those layers mean. They're probably not going to get it, but you're also boring them. This was a big problem. Like I worked at a big technology company. A lot of our architects love to talk technical diagrams. And when they presented the technical audiences, that was the most popular part of the presentation. But it was painful to watch the business audience. So always remember, you put up an architectural or technical diagram, no matter how well you explain it, this is what your audience is going to see. A bunch of gobbledygook on the screen, and you're losing valuable time you could have focused on something they cared about. So absolutely minimize the amount of time you would ever spend on such things. And then another that comes often from people cutting and pasting straight from stuff as well. Just use shading. Here's a table. We can argue whether I should show this much data at once. Let's just say 1 and 2. This isn't, quote, wrong. I mean, it's pretty clear, but just doing something to add a little shading and make the headers pop out makes it so much easier to interpret. The reality is to go to the little extra effort to add this type of formatting is very small. The impact on your audience, particularly over a large series of slides, can be very big. It's these little things that ironically can make a pretty big difference. So Nathan, I'll pause here for you again.
I am not seeing any questions for that section, but I want to answer to a chat message from Mary. She's saying, do they not teach color theory in engineering and data science classes? No, I do not think they do.
No. Most data science classes and curriculums actually don't teach most of what I'm talking about. They would focus you explicitly on the opposite, because your professor wants to see the p-values. They want to see how deep your neural net went, et cetera. And they train you actually to do the opposite of what you need to do in business, which is what's so frustrating. I think there's very little avenues to learn some of what I'm talking about other than learning it hard on the job or picking up some books like this from people who have done it. So let's go on to your final preparation. You've developed a strategy, you've laid out your presentation and the plan for it, you diligently developed all your slides. Now you got to get ready to go deliver it. So the key to this is while you do your preparation, the final preparation, you're looking for the places where your story isn't quite as strong as you'd like. Maybe it's not flowing as well as you think it should. Maybe you realize you need a little bit more or less detail. This is your chance to finish it off. So to do that, you've got to practice. This is a really big thing. I can tell you, I have spent over the years tons of time the night before a big presentation, just in my hotel room. I go and I'm just presenting it to myself. I'm walking around the room. I'm coming here, just sitting next on the slide and just talking to the room with no one but me. But the reason I do that is by doing that, I'm forcing myself to actually verbalize everything I'm going to say. And as I do it, I will stumble at places. I will not know what I should say at some places. And then I'll be aware of that and I'll know how to fix it for the next time. Here's the thing. Very few people are going to draft a paper and send the first draft. Very few people are going to develop a presentation, and the first time they draft the slide, they never come back to it. I have seen people get in front of a room, even for an important presentation, having never actually verbalized their presentation until that moment. And just like your first draft paper, you'll find all kinds of typos and things that you've got to reword. And just like when you go back to your PowerPoints, after you first, you'll find typos, you'll find that you need to add stuff. You will find that in your presentation. You don't want to find that in front of the room that you need to sell. It looks sloppy and it'll set you way, way back. So you want to set aside this time to go through it and make sure that you know what you're going to say. But counterintuitively, do not over-prepare. You can prepare too much. The worst thing you can do is sit and read slides. Not too far behind that is when you've practiced so much that you know exactly word for word what you want to say and you're effectively reciting it from your brain. What I will do is put 2 or 3 bullet points down for every slide that I have or every concept I want to get across. And in fact, I have that in front of me now in case I forgot what I want to say. I have like 3 bullets for each one of these. I could deliver this same slide 7 times to 7 audiences today. And if you went and got the transcript, I will have said substantively the same thing, but I will have said it very differently each time because I don't have an actual script for this slide. I have 2 or 3 points that I know that I want to make, and I just kind of go with it each time. So you want to be in that comfort zone. If you're just going to recite to people, I always say, if all you have to say to people is exactly what's on your slides, then don't even do a presentation. Save everybody the hassle. Email them the slides and say everything you need is on the slide. If you have questions, send me a note. Another thing you can look for are cases where you could scale your figures differently to make them relatable to the maximum extent. This isn't about, back to the other problem I talked earlier, not having a scale, having a misleading scale. This isn't about misleading, it's about making it easy to understand. So you may have a data set that looked at how many minutes people were lost in the wilderness and the chance that they died. That does reflect your data. So you come up and say, hey, for every minute lost, the chance of death goes up by 0.06%. This doesn't sound like anybody needs to get too uptight about going out looking for the person that we just found out is lost. But in reality, we don't ever think about minutes of being lost, even if that's what our data is. People tend to think about days. So here, if I put it in day terms, it's 86.4%. Now that gets everybody's attention. You're now saying, boy, we better get out there and find that person before sun sets. And certainly right after the sun comes up in the morning if we haven't. Both of these are mathematically the same, but in one case, you're scaling it to exactly what will resonate with the audience. And that could be very different from what your data is. Similarly, you might have how many minutes of SAT tutoring a student had and how many points they got on their SAT. Well, per minute of SAT tutoring, it's going to be very, very small. But typically, a student's going to have, say, a semester of AT&T tutoring. So say it'll be the same kind of relationship here. It's not being misleading. It's putting things at the proper scale. And when you do your dry run, you'll often realize, boy, this doesn't look too impressive. And so I need to adjust it, or it doesn't look like what people are expecting. You can also purposely simplify things. So here's some parameter estimates. I have a non-technical audience. Are they going to know what does 5.2 and 1.3 mean? Do I really want to get into that with them? I think what they care about is this. For the live presentation, hey, you know what? In the appendix, I've got all the parameters. If you want to dive into them, we can. But what we've reflected here for you is which of these factors are positively associated, negatively associated, which are basically neutral in terms of wine consumption. Everyone gets this very quickly, very clearly. If they want to go into the details, you could then take them into the details. I'd suggest 90% of the time in a live presentation, they'll actually be thrilled with this. And after the presentation, they'll likely keep this slide around more than the one with the actual parameters in it, even if you did, in fact, give them those parameters. And back to the numbers, make them stand out. When you're doing your final walkthrough, and you can do this as you build them too, but your final walkthrough, you'll see again exactly what you're focusing on. So I might have a real simple chart like this. And where do you really want to focus on this? Well, there's a couple things you can do. You can do things like circle. You can do things like, bold and then have an arrow pop up. You can do things like have it expand and come up in red. Because in this case, this would be a bit of a problem if bringing me gifts is the best path to an A. But the point is, these are just some real simple tricks that will really add clarity for an audience as to where they should be looking. Even with only 4 numbers on the screen, they know exactly where I want them looking as I talk. And you can do the same thing with text. I'm going to have them all pop up at once, but you have a number of bullet points. You should be building these out one by one as you talk to them, but you can do bolding, you can do underlining, you can do coloring, etc. Whatever is going to help you get those points across as easy as possible. You should look for the opportunity to do that. And people appreciate it because, again, this slide, when it's all built out in a leave behind, to see the key things in each line does help focus people, again, on what your main points are. So, Nathan, I'll do a pause here real quick.
I still think you're okay to continue. The 3 questions that we have, I think would be best to save for the end because I think some of them might take a little longer to respond to.
All right. The last phase is delivering. You're actually in front of a room. You're actually there delivering live. So I've already kind of talked about this. Do not read your slides ever. I don't know if any of you all, or some of you certainly are old enough to remember the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off. There was this horrible teacher, and he'd step there and he would talk in a monotone voice and then say, does anyone know the answer? Anyone? Anyone? anyone, Bueller, etc. If you haven't seen the movie, that probably made no sense, but it's a funny movie. Point being, you don't want to read your slides, like I already said. If that's all you're going to do, just email the things. It destroys your credibility and it shows you don't really know your content. Another huge one for online is you have to look at the camera. So I'm going to illustrate this. The whole point of Zoom is supposedly to connect with people. Well, here's the thing. If I'm talking to you in person, I'm looking right at you. So right now I'm going to come in closer. I'm looking right into the camera. Your brains are interpreting that I'm looking right at you because I'm looking at the camera. It's coming right out your screen. However, Nathan starts talking. So I look down at Nathan and he's kind of on the top left. To you now, my eyes are looking down in a way a little. Let's say it's somebody at the bottom of the screen who asks a question. I look down at them. Now my head's down, my eyes are down. I feel like I'm connecting perfectly with this person because I'm looking directly at him as I've been taught to do when I talk. But everybody on the receiving end thinks I'm totally disengaged. So when you are talking on any live presentation, you have to look at the camera and only at the camera and ignore all the video. When you're listening to others, you can look at the video. This is counterintuitive and it's completely a common error that people make. And I can tell you, I remind myself all the time, even today, every time Nathan has popped up, I find myself looking at him and I have to remind myself, look back at the camera. And I'll bet you all probably found a few times where I was slow to do that and I was looking away. But you want to look right at it every time. One or two last things. Stress the positive, right? We're analytical people. We like to be honest. We like to be open. We want to make sure we give all the right caveats. And that's a great a set of traits. Don't get me wrong. But imagine I come into a meeting and we've analyzed, let's say, a US level analysis for all the regions, but we're not done with the Northeast. I can come in and say, hey, we have these cool results, but unfortunately, we don't have the Northeast done yet, so we can't do a national rollout. Hopefully, we can talk about that next week. That's kind of negative. I'd rather come in and say, great news. We have amazing results in every region except the Northeast. The Northeast, we don't know yet because we're still running the numbers. We could get started with the implementation for the other regions today. And by the time we're done with that, we'll have our results for the Northeast ready to go. It's the same facts, but a lot more positive. Again, the semantics and context matter because a lot of people, especially if they're more creative types like marketing or advertising, they aren't necessarily used to being as blunt and matter of fact as many of us analytical people are. They like to be a little more flowery and positive in their language. So here's another example, right? We had unexpected data issues, so we couldn't produce any results for the specialty category. That's a really bummer way to end, especially if I've just gone through some good results for the other categories. Again, just spin it around. We've got high confidence it applies for all our products outside of the specialty category. We're validating that now, and we anticipate the results are going to hold. But we can get started on the implementation for everything else. It's a way to just make people focus on that positive because you want them to take action after they're done, and the less cold water you throw on their excitement. Tying facts to impacts is another important thing. Here's a classic thing. Maybe our data showed us because we had just data on complication rates, 10% drop. Sounds good, but what does that mean? If you're a hospital administrator, a 10% change in complication rates, you know that's important, but what you care about are patient outcomes in terms of deaths, and you care about the finances. Connect those dots for them. Don't just show that, but show the other things. It's this many drop in complications and hospitalizations and deaths, and equally important in the cost per patient. This is what people want to see, this full context. If you don't connect these dots, you run two risks that both lead nowhere. First is the audience doesn't go to the effort of connecting these dots back to the dollars, or worse, they connect the dots and do it improperly. You want to make it as easy as possible for them to see exactly what the key point is so that they're ready to take action. Connecting these dots does that. And I'll leave you with the last point, and we'll finish with a little Q&A. Close with a wow that ties to a larger context. And what I mean by that is oftentimes we have a tactical analysis today, the marketing campaign for last quarter, the product test from last week. Look for ways to make it even bigger. It's not just that our honey analysis we talked about earlier showed that the organic honey sales increased, but you close with the audience and remember, 2 of our 5 corporate core strategies over the coming 3 to 5 years is to do more organic business and more direct consumer engagement. This campaign hits both of those. Now everybody's excited because A, the executive is going to be like, that's how I get my bonus. That's how I get my promotion, is hitting these core corporate initiatives. But equally important, you're helping them see that, yeah, this was a tactical analysis today on this campaign, but it is a lot more than that. Going after this is going to help us succeed as a company on our core goals. It gets people more excited. So I think we did questions as we went, so we don't have a whole lot of time, but here's my contact information if you have questions later, and I'll turn it back to you, Nate.
Perfect. Thanks, Bill. Before we go into questions, and Bill, I want to make sure, do you have is it okay if we go 10 minutes over time, or do you have something you need to rush to?
I can go a little over if you can go a little. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So before we start questions, mostly so that I can give people a little bit of time to type those out, I am going to talk about, Bill, I'm going to take over the screen, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about our upcoming webinars. And then, Bill, when I'm done, you can reshare that final slide because I'm sure people will want to see that as well. So first, we have, where are my notes here? There they are. So how to make artificial intelligence and business intelligence work together like a dream team. And this is gonna, teach you how to use these two together to create business value. And we have Tobias Swingman, who's going to be presenting this. He's the co-founder of Rapid AI, and this is going to be happening July 12th at 11:30 a.m. Pacific. So just a half hour before this one started. And then if I can move the Zoom menu for me always pops up in the wrong place. I tell you what. And then also we have on July 13th at 10 a.m. Pacific, how to detect silent features in ML models. And this is just going to teach us how to detect silent ML model failure, like data and concept drift. And with that, and I'll apologize to Wojtek when I see him or Kurt, because I'm going to butcher this person's name. But we have Wojtek Kuberski. They're the co-founder of Nanny ML. So those are the two presentations that we're going to have next week. Bill, if you'd like to reshare your screen so we can get all of your information back up there. And then we do have quite a few questions that came up while I was doing that as well. And I want to make sure comments are, okay, perfect. So question number one, and we'll start at the top. So this is from David. Would using short videos be more effective than still images or photos?
So, this is what I always say, there's no right answer that fits every scenario. I would say if it's a short video, let's say it's a demo of something and you want to actually have a demo instead of screenshots, that could be really appropriate. If it's a short video of someone throwing a Frisbee instead of someone, in a picture about to throw a Frisbee, that's just kind of an accent graphic or something, then it might not add a lot of value. So I would say if you had a reason to use a video, I would not have a problem with that, but I wouldn't make it relevant. I would say another thing you could use potentially video is if you wanted to have, even if it was more of an animation than a video, but you wanted to have like a motion across the slide, like different bars kind of appear one after the other, and you add some arrows, you do some things like that. You could, instead of having a massively built slide that you do live, you might record yourself going through that build and just have the video kind of pop up like a GIF might, that'll run through and show it to you. So back to not getting more fancy than you need to. If a video, you can justify that it makes sense, I wouldn't have a problem with it. I would suspect that people would tend to overuse video once they started to, though, because it seems novel and cool, and people always want to do whatever's novel and cool at the expense of what is proven to work. Okay.
And then this one's from Anita, and they have done hypothesis testing to find if groups have significant difference. How do they explain to their stakeholders that the result is statistically significant and result can be trusted? Should they explain them like t-tests, the p-value, confidence intervals, etc.?
That's a really, really good question. And this is an age-old thing. So back to our earlier thing, you should have in an appendix or in your notes somewhere that you could have where you said, here was the average for group A, here was the average for group B, here's the t-test result, here's the confidence interval and the range, for example. But in a live audience, honestly, this gets back to, go back to my mechanic example from much earlier. When I don't know how to fix cars, I don't want to know how to fix cars. I don't care how to fix cars. I take it to the mechanic because I want them to fix my transmission and tell me that it's done. And I would just want to trust them that they're going to give me a fair price. This is what the audience wants from you. They're coming to you because they don't know how to do a t-test. They don't want to do a t-test. They don't want to know how a t-test works. They want to know, can I trust these results? So what you can focus on with an audience like that is, look, I have statistical training. I did some rigid statistical tests, and I'm here to tell you that these results can be trusted. As long as you're comfortable with a range of 8 to 10% on the response, you're good to go. They'll be happy and thrilled that you gave an answer like that because that's the level they want. They just want to know that you're confident and that they can have confidence in you and that they can trust the results. That's the key. They're trusting you. One of the points I didn't cover that finishes section 1 of the book is at the end of the day, the audience, no matter what facts, figures, charts, layouts you put up, they're actually buying you, the individual presenting, or if there's a couple of you through a series, those people presenting, they have to trust that you are credible, that you seem to know what you have done, and that they believe that they can act on what you've said. And at the end of the day, you can convince them that something's statistically significant, but if they come away just feeling like you didn't have much confidence and you didn't seem like you really knew the data very well and all, they might say, I believe she knows her t-test, but I'm not trusting her analysis because I'm not confident she really understands our data or our business. So it's all about gaining that trust from that audience.
Okay. And this next question, I think, is from someone on YouTube. So how deeply do you go into describing the models you use, if at all? Is it just mainly highlighting the results in a translatable manner? Cheers.
Yes, to a non-technical audience, I would cover the models almost as little as possible. Back to it, I might say quickly, and we do this, like the capstone I teach. I make the students do this. You can say, we used a logistic regression model in this case because we thought it was best, and we found these factors were the most predictive. And every now and then, so, well, what's a logistic? Then you can go on a little bit, but again, another topic I didn't cover is go into depth only to the extent needed to answer the question. So if I were to say we use a logistic regression, and a non-technical person goes, "Oh, tell me about that. What is that?" Don't go all the way into it's a logistic regression that minimizes error in this way, that has this curve that goes like an S and blah, blah, blah. Start with the minimum. Oh, a logistic helps us predict something that's a binary, a yes, no. And right now we're predicting response or not. It's perfect for that scenario. And they might go, oh, perfect. Or they might go, okay, but tell me how it does that. And you can go a little bit more as they drive you there, but always give as a little extra detail as you have to answer the question. Because normally, even when they ask a question for, quote, detail, what they mean by detail is far less than what you would mean by detail. So yeah, I would shy away. Have the record of the kind of model you used. And back to my chart with what's positive, what's negative on the parameter set, I might not even show them the raw parameters so much as those arrow charts, because does the business person need to understand that? No. What they need to know is later I'll be providing them a list of every customer scored that is ranked, and they can just say, how many do you want to target with the campaign, and we'll go target it. They don't have to understand the parameters, specific values, or any of that. Or they might say, I just want to know what levers could I pull? What were the most predictive things? Because I can tune my marketing for that. Then you're just back to the same thing. Oh, it was age and it was income that were most important. If you're going to do some segmented targeting, focus on age and income based on our results. But you don't have to go into those specific parameters and so forth.
Okay. And then this is from an anonymous attendee. But do you think the whole fake it till you make it can help improve confidence if you are a bad presenter? What are some other presentation tips aside from practice?
So there's two things. I'm not a fan of ever, so faking it in terms of if someone asks a question, you don't know the answer, never fake it. Always say, don't know, I'll have to get back to you. But in terms of if you're not a good presenter, fake it till you make it. Honestly, let me start with the best case. You're not a very confident presenter and you're really uncomfortable to go present this analysis to, say, a VP. Tell your boss, you know what, can I present this to you for some practice, but I'd really feel better if you present it to the VP because I just don't think I can do it well enough yet. Let me practice. And you can, or practice, present it to some of your coworkers, and you can all help each other get better till you are confident enough to do it. I think like anything else, there's nothing wrong. I played soccer for a lot of years. Maybe I'm coming back from an injury. There was no shame in saying, you know what, coach, keep me on the bench a little more today and maybe give me 10 or 15 minutes to test it out, but I'm not ready to go in full force, right? It's the same thing. Anybody who's been around, I mean, I used to run a very large global team. I would have loved it if someone came and was honest with me before a big presentation, said, Bill, I just don't feel ready. Or maybe I'm sick, right? Pre-COVID days, I think I might have a flu developing and I might feel really bad tomorrow. I'm afraid I'll do a bad job. Can you line somebody else up to give the presentation? Yes, all day long. So practice, I think there's no way to get good without practice, just like any other skill. I would say if you're forced to give a presentation and there's no other option and you know you're going to do bad, back to being yourself and earning the trust, just be real honest. You know what? I've got assigned to present this to you today. I'm going to tell you up front, I'm not a very good presenter. I'm really nervous and I'm already embarrassed about that. I'm not going to be the kind of presenter you're used to seeing. But I'm hoping that you'll focus on the facts and the important findings I'm going to walk you through. And we can talk through those. And if you hit that head on too, I'd like to put the elephants on the table, which is a common phrase where I'm from. And you hit it head on. People will respect the heck out of that you just acknowledge you're nervous. You don't think you're going to do that great a job at the presentation, but you are convinced that what you're presenting is very important and very relevant.
Perfect. And then also another anonymous person, what do you think of data visualization whitewashing or sanitizing bad data? Is there data visualization code of conduct that is accepted in the industry?
That's a tough one. So when I hear whitewashing, what I'm hearing is like cover up, like take the scale off or do other things. I'm always for back to even these things I said, adjusting the scale. It's about making the information as accessible as possible. If it's bad news, it's got to reflect the bad news. If A beat B, it has to show that A beat B. I'm not a fan of any tool, visualization or otherwise, that is used for a purpose of attempting to downplay facts that are inconvenient for either the presenter, in terms of we had a real problem in our analysis that we're embarrassed about, or the person you're presenting to in terms of, yeah, this idea you had was really bad, Mr. or Mrs. VP, and sorry, it's not going anywhere based on this analysis. So I think it is a risk that people will sometimes try and use the, extra flash or fancy things to try and distract people. Again, in the end of the day, they're probably going to see through it, and it's better that you hit it head on and you're the one delivering it than letting them figure it out on their own and then say, well, why the heck did Bill not make this clear?
Okay. And we have 3 more questions, so we'll end after those 3 questions.
Okay.
This is also a question from Javier. Related to the style of the presentation, and unless I must use a corporate template, I also take the approach of using a plain style or white style, etc. But don't you envy those templates with beautiful backgrounds, full-size photographs, etc.? Are those templates meant for data presentations?
Okay, this gets back to it. It can depend. There are companies that love those things, and there are companies that literally even their CEO will get a presentation and it's just black text with black bullet points. If I go into the place that uses black text and bullet points all the way to the CEO with a flowery background, I'm probably going to have some issues. On the flip side, if I go into a company and they're all about these really cool presentations and they all use these fancy templates, I show up with black text, I'm probably in trouble. So this gets back to knowing your audience. You got to know who you're presenting to. You got to kind of know their standards. I don't add stuff just for the sake of it typically. I think a little basic, if you notice my presentation, I would say I've added some color, I've added some graphics, but I've tried, this slide obviously is a wrap-up slide, it's overdone, but some of the other ones, just enough. I'm a fan of accent graphics, like I'm presenting to Coke, put a little Coke can over here, or put a little screenshot of a Coke ad that's small and on it to fill some white space. I'm okay with all of those things. It's all a matter of not overdoing it so that you lose the message. Every chart, it should be very easy to get to. Here's the main point. And, if there's a pretty background behind the point, that's fine. If there's not, that's fine. The key is that they walk away with that main point. Because in the end, if they think you had a pretty presentation, but they don't do anything, who cares?
And then also from a YouTube user, oftentimes you don't have revolutionary results and the purpose of the presentation is mainly a status update on your work. How do you show how much work you've done without showing the details?
So this gets back to, this is an age-old problem. And again, I made this mistake a lot early in my career. Well, this VP will be really impressed if they know how hard we worked. We were up late a few nights. We had to solve this data problem and that data problem and work through this issue and da-da-da. You know what? It sounds horrible, right? But the blunt truth is they don't care, right? They don't care. If it's your direct chain of command, They're going to care to know that you're doing your job. What you can say is, we did our usual monthly process, of acquiring all the data and doing our regular cleansing, blah, blah, blah. Nothing much came out this month. It's pretty much status quo. Good news is we can continue as planned and just keep the presentation short. I mean, the reality is, if you're adding value to the organization, they're going to know that you're adding value. And if you're not, they're going to know that too. So if you have some presentations at times that are kind of a no excitement, not a big thing, just be honest about, hey, we went through all the usual work, and in this case, didn't pan out with anything big, but now we know. And so we're excited to move on to these 2 tests next month that might have a better result, as an example. I think the key is, if you try to make if you come from the angle of, well, these results aren't that exciting, but I promise you we worked really hard and we're all really smart, and that comes across kind of negatively to people when they hear it, even if your intentions are good. It just doesn't come across well. And I've seen people have that backfire all the time, where they talk about how hard no one cares. I don't care how hard the mechanic worked to fix my transmission. I mean, I do at some level. I care that it's fixed. I actually would be, if he goes, you know what, I was able to fix it for $500 by just removing and replacing 1 screw. That's awesome. I'd rather have that than he spent a week disassembling the entire transmission and reassembling it by hand to make sure it's perfect, but I had to pay him $5,000 for that, right? So it comes back to, the effort's only relevant to the extent that it adds some value to me right then. If the results were ho-hum, the effort, again, I'm glad you put it in, and you can let it be known we had to put in the full effort to find that result, but don't go in too much detail and overkill it. And I probably beat that one to death, so I'll stop.
Okay, and this is our last Patrick. This is our last question from Patrick. Patrick, I promise you're not the last Patrick. So I know you spoke about this a bit. What do you do when someone in the audience asks a technical question that the asker himself and majority of the audience will have a hard time understanding?
Excellent question. And I'll give you the same answer, because there's 2 or 3 variations on that too. What about when there is a technical person in the audience who's asking that question, and you know that no one else will get it? That's where I think, again, I would typically, my first answer would be, you know what? I can get into a lot of technical details here. I'm not sure if we have time or if you really want to. So let me just see, do other people also want to go there or not? Because if not, then we could take it offline. Right? And typically everyone, oh, no, let's just move on. Okay, yeah, hey, Nathan, you and I can meet offline. You can also have people do this to trip you up. Like, you might have an adversary who is purposely asking you questions to make your presentation go off the rails. So somebody from a rival analytics team asks you a very technical question so they can sound smart, knowing that it's a weak point of yours to make you look bad. Well, the bottom line is, if you go into this battle with them, you're just going to succeed in looking bad to everybody. Don't play the game. Just be like, you know what? I don't think that's as much of a relevant topic here. Can we go offline? If they keep pushing it, at some point, the audience will save you. If the audience doesn't want to go where the person's taking you, they'll jump in and say, yeah, let's table that. If they actually do, you'll be forced to do it. As long as you're prepared, that's fine. But I always say, validate how much they want. And if someone says, I really like to know the details, can I just make sure, do you really want to go into all the parameters? Do you just kind of want to know the percentage of variance that we explained? You just want to know how much confidence we have in it? Like, when you say you want the details, what do you actually mean here? And then they might go, oh, well, I just mean, like, how many things were significant and what are those things? You go, oh, well, that was what my next slide was. Here are the factors that came out in the model. It's just a matter of being aware of who's in that audience. And similarly, you might get totally random and off the wall questions of somebody has no clue what you're talking about, and it shows. You can't just say, that was a really dumb question, Nathan. I don't know why you asked that, especially if they're the big cheese in the room. This happens, right? You just got to kind of come up with it. Hey, you know what? That's an interesting one. I've never actually had the question asked that way. I'm gonna have to think about that and maybe get back to you. Or if it is a silly question, but you do have an answer, even though it's silly, you can just give the answer and then move on, and let the rest of the audience might be like, I cannot believe that person asked that question. But they'll also think it was good that you at least answered it and moved on quickly.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Bill, for being here with us today, and for staying late and answering all of these questions. And I appreciate, for those of you that stuck around, thank you very much for sticking around, and thank you for your patience. And then for everyone who joined, thank you for being here. We hope to see you next week on the 12th or the 13th, or on both days, for our webinars next week. I also want to call out Fatima Rafiq. I think she's online with us still. Thank you for setting this up. Fatima does all the logistics and reaches out to everyone. So thank you all for joining. Thank you, Bill, and I hope everybody has a good rest of their day.
Thanks all.